During the late 1950s, the tension between the United States and the Soviet Union was higher than anybody had ever thought it could be. Part of the reason that this was the case was due to the use of nuclear submarines. A nuclear submarine runs off of nuclear power instead of diesel-electric power. The advantage was that a nuclear-powered sub could stay underwater and not have to surface as often as a diesel-electric powered sub. They could also go faster for a longer period of time, which allows the sub to cover more distance. A great idea behind it was the idea that they could go out to an unknown location in the middle of the ocean and aim and fire a ballistic missile anywhere in the world. They were virtually unstoppable. This technology sounds great right up until you realize that the missile can be pointed directly back at your country. The Americans were credited with being the first to successfully power submarines using nuclear technology, but the Soviets soon caught on. The Soviets had about 400 submarines, which I should note, most of them were built before the nuclear power invention was established, so they were really just regular diesel-electric submarines, but regardless, they had numbers. The U.S. would only have about 150 subs and had the upper hand on the Soviets by using advanced technology. The United States eventually decided to release a new class of submarines called the Thresher class. The Thresher class was a class of nuclear-powered, fast attack submarines. This was the moment that the USS SSN 593 Thresher was laid down. This sub was the lead boat of its class of nuclear-powered attack submarines in the United States Navy. The Thresher, being the first of its class, performed a lot of tests. In fact, it did so for about a year. After all of its testing was done, a couple of weeks after that, on April 10th, 1963, the sub went out for a regular deep dive test with another ship called the Skylark. At about 7:47 a.m., the Thresher began its dive to about 1,000 feet, which was its final test depth. Once it got to 400 feet, they stopped to contact the surface, and the crew inspected the entire ship for leaks. There were none found, and so they then descended to the final test depth of 1,000 feet. It is believed that a brazed pipe joint ruptured in the engine room. After this, the contact with the Skylark was garbled, and Skylark couldn't understand what was happening, and all they got was that the Thresher said, experiencing minor difficulty, have positive up angle, attempting to blow. Unfortunately, they never did make it up, and about an hour later, the Skylark still had not heard from them. At this point, the Skylark contacted the mainland, and a huge search for the sub was initiated. The sub was officially lost. This horrible accident intrigued me to learn more about the safety and technology behind submarines. So I interviewed Brian Hagemeyer, who was a petty officer, third-class sonar technician.
One thing that the submarines have is they have like what they call an emergency blow system. So if for some reason, the submarine starts going too deep and controls are lost or something, and there's no way to get it going back up, they can basically they blow their tanks, because the way that the submarines work underwater is it's all buoyancy. So they use water inside tanks that are in the front and the back. They fill them up and down to help get to some of the depths. Obviously, they can change the angle and use the propeller to go deeper too. But you can float in the water as well. So these tanks, they can blow the tanks and it'll get the momentum of the boat going in the upwards direction. So it starts getting too low. So it can do that. It can also, they also have, different, they have like for a situation where they went too deep, they have like, little pods that you get into that are basically where you come down in the entrance. So you can get into these pods, and then you can, basically they shoot up. But not everybody can be in them. So it's only a select people that are going to get in those things. So those are the main things that prevent it. But I think just the technology, just themselves, the submarines, and what they know on what they've learned just about the underwater environment, they're able to kind of prevent that from happening. I mean, they can go pretty deep now. So
yeah.
Now there's so much inspections and testing and things like that they do that they never did that back then. They did maintenance and things like that, but the boat, there's specific guidelines and checklists that they go through to do maintenance on these things, and that's really all your job is doing maintenance on the boat the whole time. So you're testing equipment, you're checking it all the time. There's a lot of times where you're not in communication with anybody that's on land or anywhere else. There's no other outside way of. I mean, if you're on the surface, you can communicate, or if you're close to the surface, you can communicate with, different places. But when you go down and you're underwater, it's just the crew in the boat.
Yeah.
There's no way to figure out. So you have to rely on all the instrumentation you have and all the knowledge that you have to just rely on that. There's two types of boats that they have, two types of submarines. One they call it kind of a fast attack boat, and then the other one's like a boomer or a more of a deterrent type boat. So what that means is the fast attack ones are the ones that are out there. They've got the torpedoes. They're the ones that are cruising all over looking for things.
Yeah.
And they have a lot more communication with land, or because they'll come up and surface a lot more. But the boat I was on, was carried the nuclear missiles. So you didn't want to be found. You wanted to be out there and people not knowing where you're at. So it depends on what kind of boat you're on. The fast attacks, everybody knew where they were until, say, they got in an instance where they needed to be hidden. Then they would just dive down, and then they would stop communications with people. But our boat would go out, and we would go tool around underwater for a month and not have any communication with anyone. I think the technology I don't think it would happen again, just because of the technology that's put in place. Yeah. There would have to be, the only way it would happen would be if there was a failure of equipment, not necessarily the gauges. Like it wouldn't be the same situation. It would be something happened, like there was a fire inside, or there was an explosion inside, or something like that. And you couldn't operate things correctly, and it would go down. But just not knowing where they were at in that same situation, that would not happen.
After talking with Mr. Hagemeyer and learning a little bit about the safety and technology behind submarines, I decided to get another opinion on the topic. Not so much the safety aspect of it, but just the event in general. Here's an interview I did with Lincoln Scott. Could you just explain a little bit about your past military and Navy experience?
Yes. I was in the Army Infantry. I was stationed at Fort Irwin, California, which was the National Training Center. And we trained mechanized and light infantry soldiers on desert warfare combat readiness. My grandfather was in the Navy during World War II, and he was on a U.S. Navy airship. He was on a fleet airship with the Naval Air Engineering Station in Lakehurst, New Jersey. And they patrolled the coast of New Jersey, New York for Nazi submarines coming over and leaving mines in the area.
Could you just talk about what the incentive was of the U.S. and the reason for making the Thresher and subs like it?
Yes, I believe the Thresher was built as a sub to hunt and kill Soviet subs. At the time, it was the fastest and quietest. It was nuclear powered, and it was equipped with both passive and active sonar, so it could detect other subs at greater distance. It was also able to fire the new naval anti-sub missiles, and at the time, that was a devastating weapon against the Soviets. It was also named after the Thresher shark.
How were the relations with the U.S. and other countries at the time?
At the time of the sinking of the Thresher, we were at war in Vietnam. There was we were right in the aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it was the height of the Cold War. So our relations with a large part of the world, the Soviets and a lot of Asian countries at the time, communist bloc, was not very good.
Mm-hmm. And lastly, could you just talk about what made the Thresher stand out and why it was so excellent and superb compared to the other submarines?
I believe it was the first, one of the first nuclear subs of the time. It ran the fastest and quietest. It was the most well-equipped sub to hunt Soviet submarines, and so I think for that reason it was the lead sub in its class at the time.
All right. Well, that wraps up the interview. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Hearing and learning about the Thresher was very interesting. The accident was probably the worst submarine accident to ever happen. There have only been 2 cases where the amount of men lost were more than 100 men. A Russian submarine that lost 118 men was called, I believe, the Kursk. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. And the USS Thresher losing 129 men. This sub was also the world's first nuclear sub lost at sea. This terrible event inspired safety programs and redesigned production plans for submarines. The accident of the USS Thresher was the most horrific submarine accident to ever happen, and because of it, the U.S. has taken a new safety measure to make sure that the odds of this happening again are beautifully small.